This week in the Psychology of Education, memory. We're going to be talking about an influential theory within educational psychology and psychology as a whole called information processing theory, and breaking down several types of memory that are discussed within this theory. So let's get started. So in the Willingham article for this week, you're going to see a really simple model, visual model, meaning a visual in this case, of how memory works. He explains that we get information from the environment. This can be people, books, the internet, sensory, but basically any information that we acquire through our sensory modalities, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. This information from the environment comes into our working memory. So when we talk about memory in psychology, we're not going to use it as just a singular lump term. We're going to separate it into different types here, working and long-term. And so working memory is you're consciously thinking whatever you're consciously thinking about. And your long-term memory is sort of this store of factual knowledge, declarative knowledge, concepts, understanding, procedural knowledge. So the physical skills, things like riding a bike, those things that you have stored in your memory that you can pull up later. And long-term memories can be things that are like an hour old, a day old, to many years or decades old. And there's a relationship between working memory and long-term memory, and this is basically a model of information processing theory, this is that you are holding things consciously in your mind. That's your working memory. You're trying, and this used to be called short-term, but they re-termed it working because focusing on the active component of memory. Whatever you're actively, consciously aware of at the moment, you're thinking about right now, and you store some of that in long-term memory. You then pull some information from long-term memory out into your working memory. And these occur in different regions of the brain, and research is really, over the past decades, been finding out more about how this actually works in terms of how memories are stored within the neurons and synapses within your brain. But that's a discussion for another time. I want to show one more model before we get into things too far. So this is a really simple model, and I think this is a really helpful model. Sometimes you will see models of memory and information processing theory that look more like this, and this has a few more steps to it. So we've still got, and I think I can draw on here. So here we have working memory, and again down here we've got working memory. We have long-term memory down here. We've got long-term memory up here, and we see these arrows are bidirectional between working and long-term memory. What this expanded model at the bottom adds is that this incoming information, which is referred to up here as the environment, first passes through our sensory register. This is whatever of the five senses that the information is coming in. That might be auditory, that might be visual, that might be like touch or sensation. And it's going to come there really fast, and you may not pay attention to it, and it gets forgotten. But if it does enter your conscious awareness, it can make it into working memory, of which it might be forgotten. You can sort of loop things through your working memory, rehearsing them over and over again. You might take some things from working memory, move them into long-term through this process called encoding. And then you may retrieve your long-term memories back into your conscious awareness working memory. Okay. So to give a little more information about this model, in the sensory memory now, this is extremely, extremely brief. We're talking like 1 to 2 seconds for auditory. If you think sort of, if you hear somebody say a word, how long is that word reverberating in your mind, or in your sort of mind's ear, until you forget it if you don't try actively to pay attention. And visual, really, we're talking far less than a second. So if something flashes up on the screen and then disappears and there's a blank screen, that visual trace is going to sort of remain within your sensory modality for about 0.25 seconds. Now, if you pay attention to the information that's entering these different sensory traces, it'll enter your working memory. Working memory we think about as being an actively processing component. It's where thinking is happening. And an important piece of it is really limited in its duration. And we're going to explore that momentarily. So I guess I add in here it's limited in duration and it's limited in capacity. And this is different from long-term memory, which is potentially limitless. We all know that we can't necessarily remember everything that we want to all the time. Not everything makes it into our long-term memory. But there's no real evidence that there is a cap on long-term memory. And long-term memory is different from, say, your computer's hard drive, which is remembering everything exactly as it was. If you type a word into your Word document or some numbers into Excel, or you do a search in your internet browser, it's remembering exactly what you did. Our minds, our brains don't quite work like this. And we're actually, in long-term memory, restructuring and reorganizing our long-term memories every time we retrieve a memory from long-term into working. And when we encode new information into long-term memory, it's integrating and changing our long-term memories and conceptualizations. Okay, so let's give a quick test of our working memory. I'm going to read you a sequence of numbers, and I want you to see if you can maybe set your pencil down to see if you can remember this sequence. All right, first one, here we go. 4, 9, 2, 0, 7, 2, 8. Pick up your pencils, see what you remember. Okay, let's try another set. You can pause if you still want to keep writing. All right, sequence number 2. Pencils down. 5, 2, 4, 1, 6, 2, 3, 0, 9, 5, 3, 6, 7, 2, 8. See if you can write that one down. All right, hit pause if you need a little bit more time. We're going to show you the sequences here. How much of sequence 1 did you get right? How much of sequence 2 did you get right? What does this tell you about how much you can think about at one time? Are there strategies you could have used to remember more? These are things we're going to be exploring throughout the week. So there's this long-standing idea that we can remember about 7 items in an adult's working memory capacity. And so this is 7 plus or minus 2. 7 minus 2 is 5. So the range is, for most people, is from about 5 to about 9. 7 minus 2 and 7 plus 2, 5 to 9 items. That's the average adult working memory capacity. There's been some controversy over whether this is actually the right number. Other people say if we're actively thinking about things that are more complicated than just, say, hearing a number or hearing a letter or something like that, that the actual capacity is much smaller, perhaps only around like 3 or 4 items that we can think of, 3 or 4 meaningful items at a time. The exact number, I think, is less important than thinking about when you're teaching, are you matching what information you're presenting with your students' ability to hold things in mind? Are you giving them sequences that look like sequence number 2? Are you just sort of blazing through your lecture, your instruction? They don't have any time to pause and stop and think and write, and therefore they've already forgotten what happened at the beginning? Or are you giving them sequences that are like sequence 1, perhaps even easier than sequence 1, so that it feels really manageable? There are some important developmental shifts in working memory capacity. So in this chart here, we see age from about 4 years old up until post high school age. And so we see this sort of somewhat linear function where there's a steeper incline, steadier increase in working memory capacity early on, and that kind of evens out as we get older. But the likelihood is that you all are still increasing your working memory capacity slightly through your 20s. And these scores here are not how many things kids could remember. This is on a different test of working memory capacity. And so it's not like you remember 15 things, it's that you got a score of 15. And I can't remember if this might be like they did 5 measures of working memory or something like that. And so something important here, so this shows the overall trajectory. These dots are individuals in the study over time, but when they looked at people and their individual trajectories, wow, we see a lot of differences. So here's someone who participated early on. Their working memory capacity actually declined as they got a little bit older. Here's somebody here whose working memory capacity it was started off really high, but then it got even higher. And so when you think about your students, yes, they're going to, in general, follow this sort of increasing, sort of sloping trend, but individually, there is a lot of variation that goes into this gradual increase. And last thing I'll show here before sending away with a few questions to think. So in this study, they had adults and they had children, and these are scans of their brains. Looking at, so we've got kind of the front up here and the back here. So this is kind of like looking top down. And so they had low working memory load tasks, medium, and high. So they gave them really essentially low are the really easy tasks. The medium tasks are sort of moderate, and the high were ones that were really difficult. And what they found in these adults, if you'll see, so the parts that are sort of brighter is where the brain was more active. And so we see some regions of the brain in adults that essentially they aren't very active with the low working memory load tasks, so the easy tasks, but as it gets more difficult, wow, there's more regions that become a lot more active relative to the other regions. And I'm not actually highlighting all of these, but we see this in adults where they're essentially ramping up or increasing the activity in their brain relative to the complexity of the task. Easy, medium, difficult. Not much activity, moderate activity, lots of activity. The interesting thing, though, in kids, they don't see this ramping up of activity. And I have to check, but I think these were, I'll have to check on the age of these kids. I think they were around 8 to 10 years old. But we don't see the same thing happening as adults. So adults are able to increase activity in their brains, or adult brains are able to increase relative to the difficulty of the task, but kids are not. So not only are kids have trouble with working memory tasks because they have a lower working memory capacity, but we also see that their brains are not sort of meeting the challenge of the working memory tasks. And so 2 questions to kind of take as you're going through this week. I want you to think about times when your working memory has been taxed or overloaded during learning. Maybe that's going to happen during this lecture here. Maybe this is happening. You'll see this happen this week. And think about what can or should teachers do with the knowledge that working memory is limited. You know that every single one of your students has a limited working memory capacity. What do you do with that? How do you change your instruction? How do you change the materials? How do you change the way that you teach? So I look forward to our discussions this week, and I'll see you at the end of the week.